Yes, they use education. And you see this, and of course, you know, young girls, we've been trained, you know, as a youngster coming up watching BT, MTV, they train us to want this. They train us to look at this and say, this is what we want in a man. We want a man with the flashy suits, with the big hats. We want a man with the goals in his teeth. A man that can't hold a proper conversation. A man that can't treat you with respect. The ones that drive the fancy cars. This is what we want, right? They teach you this on the surface. On the surface, you feel like this is what I want. But it's your subconscious. It's your subconscious that look at this guy and say, wow, he's a clown. How can I depend on a clown? Thus, you have the man tied to four horses, ripped apart in front of you.
1775, the American Revolutionary War began as the American colonies sought to detach from England and its oppressive monarchy. Though many reasons are cited for the revolution, one in particular sticks out as the prime cause: that King George III of England outlawed the interest-free, independent currency the colonies were producing and using for themselves, in turn forcing them to borrow money from the Central Bank of England at interest, immediately putting the colonies into debt. And, as Benjamin Franklin later wrote, the refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the revolution.
Money has always been used as a means to control a people. Something as useless as ink on paper have greatly influenced the mind of the Hebrew woman more than any other group of individuals. The Atlantic slave trade was, on the physical, the result of, among other things, labor shortage. Native peoples were at first utilized as slave labor by Europeans, until a large number died from overwork and man-made, purposely distributed diseases such as smallpox. Alternative sources of labor, such as indentured servitude, failed to provide a sufficient workforce. Many crops could not be sold for profit, or even grown in Europe. Exporting crops and goods from the New World to Europe often proved to be more cost-effective than producing them on the European mainland. A vast amount of labor was needed for the plantations of the intensive growing, harvesting, and processing of these prized tropical crops. And so therefore we have the institution of the Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement and transportation of Hebrew people to the colonies of the New World that occurred in and around the Atlantic Ocean to fulfill the prophecy of Deuteronomy 28:68. It lasted from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and its effects continue today as part of the curses. Most enslaved people were shipped from West Africa and Central Africa and taken to North and South America to labor on sugar, coffee, cocoa, and cotton plantations, in gold and silver mines, and rice fields, the construction industry, timber, and shipping, or in houses to work as servants. The plantation economies of the U.S. were built on slave labor. 70% of the enslaved people brought to the U.S. were used to produce sugar, the most labor-intensive crop, and as previously stated, the rest were employed harvesting cotton, coffee, and tobacco, and in some cases in mining. Historian Walter Rodney has argued that at the start of the slave trade in the 16th century, even though there was a technological gap between Europe and Africa, it was not very substantial. Both continents were using Iron Age technology. The major advantage that Europe had was in shipbuilding. During the period of slavery, the populations of Europe and the Americas grew rapidly while the population of Africa remained stagnant. Rodney contended that the profits from slavery were used to fund economic growth and technological advancement in Europe and the Americas. Based on earlier theories by Eric Williams, he asserted that the Industrial Revolution was at least in part funded by agricultural profits from the Americas. He cited examples such as the invention of the steam engine by James Watt, which was funded by plantation owners from the Caribbean.
Girl, sit down.
He won't shoot him. He won't shoot any of you.
The hell I won't.
There's a piece of paper up at the house that says you're worth $500, old man. He's not going to shoot $500 dead. Are you, Mr. Waller?
Look what he done tonight, John.
But he wasn't worth but $50. You're worth $200. You're worth $400. Nathan, you're worth $6. And you, dearly, you're worth $1,000.
Under slavery, slaves were a long-term economic investment. In 1850, an average agricultural slave in Alabama sold for $1,000 to $1,800. This was over 3 times the average yearly wage of an American worker at the time, around $50,000 to $100,000 in today's money. The profit made from a slave varied between 5% and 10%. So the slaveholder had to balance the violence needed to control the slave against the risk of an injury that would reduce profits. So one can imagine the amount of money lost once chattel slavery was abolished. The number of once wealthy slave owners, once wealthy descendants of slave owners, and those whose life depended on its profit. These were all losing power, many of which quickly became known as poor white trash. The 1800s were an era of sweeping change for the United States. The immigrant population and Reconstruction from the Civil War period played a significant role. In 1853, the New York Children's Aid Society orphan trains transported more than 110,000 poor children from Irish, Italian, and Eastern European families to be raised in royal Protestant homes away from the bad influences of their families in inner city neighborhoods. This era was also known for the transition of federal and state governments to social welfare. Subsequently, legislation was introduced which was designed to save poor white children of immigrants from unfitness and poverty. Juvenile courts would routinely commit children to institutions or foster homes for dependency, poverty, or neglect. The 1880s and 1890s were the first form of welfare in America. From 1893 to 1894, attempts were made at the first unemployment payments but were unsuccessful due to the 1893-1894 recession. In 1932, the Great Depression had gotten worse, and the first attempts to fund relief failed. The Emergency Relief Act was passed into law, giving the local government $300 million.
In 1783, America won its independence from England. However, its battle against the central bank concept and the corrupt, greed-filled men associated with it had just begun. So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that produces the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, 2 specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy with money, it loans it to them at interest. Then, through the use of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by the central bank is loaned at interest. That means every single dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percent of debt based on that dollar. And since the central bank has the monopoly over the production of the currency for the entire country, and they loan each dollar out with immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the central bank again. which means the central bank has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system without fail is slavery, for it is impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. The founding fathers of this country were well aware of this. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push, once again, legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge, that the 10 or so figures who attended were told they could only use their first names in addressing each other. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Years later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret, Congressman Louis McFadden also expressed the truth after the passage of the bill. A world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Fed has usurped the government. Now, the public was told that the Federal Reserve System was an economic stabilizer, and inflation and economic crises were a thing of the past. Well, as history has shown, nothing is further from the truth. The fact is, the international bankers now had a streamlined machine to expand their personal ambitions.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed called in mass percentages of the outstanding money supply, thus resulting in the supporting banks having to call in huge numbers of loans, and, just like 1907, bank runs, bankruptcy, and collapse occurred. over 5,400 competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed.
Before the institution of paper money, people had possession of their gold and silver. Only to someone somewhere they got tired of carrying it around. So when people was given a receipt to represent the amount in gold, the brilliant idea occurred to money manipulators that they could cheat the people, give them more receipts than they had gold, placing them into a blind state of debt. However, the people were still at an advantage because the paper represented some amount in gold. But when the financial system collapsed, there was no more gold in existence to back the receipts we call money. They simply became empty lender notes. If you look on the front of your dollar bill, you'll see something that says, "This note is legal tender," which means it is worth nothing at all. To this day, there is a value placed on the dollar that does not exist. The Social Security Bill was passed on June 17, 1935. The bill included direct relief, cash, food stamps, etc., and changes for unemployment insurance. It is at this point that the people pledged as collateral on behalf of the United States, with Social Security cards and birth certificates as receipt proofs from which those numbers could be found. The people and the government are now officially bound by covenant on paper, which means that the government has officially placed itself in a position to control the people, and it's got the Hebrew woman in its sights. Welfare, anyone?
Welfare or welfare work consists of actions or procedures, especially on the part of governments and institutions, striving to promote the basic well-being of individuals in need. These efforts usually strive to improve the financial situation of people in need, but may also strive to improve their employment chances and many other aspects of their lives, including sometimes their mental health. Welfare can take a variety of forms, such as monetary payments, subsidies and vouchers, health services, or housing. Welfare systems differ from country to country, but welfare is commonly provided to those who are unemployed, those with illness or disability, those of old age, those with dependent children, and to veterans. A person's eligibility for welfare may also be constrained by means of testing or other conditions. From the 1930s on, New York City provided welfare payments to the poor. By the 1960s, as whites moved to the suburbs, the city was having trouble making the payments and attempted to purge the rolls of those who were committing welfare fraud. Remember, in 1853, the New York Children's Aid Society orphan trains transported more than 110,000 poor children from Irish, Italian, and Eastern European families to be raised in royal Protestant homes away from the bad influences of their families in inner city neighborhoods. So who were the bad city influences during our time of upbringing in the 1960s? That's right, the so-called black people. 20 individuals who had been denied welfare sued in a case that went to the United States Supreme Court, Goldberg versus Kelly. The court ruled that those suspected of committing welfare fraud must receive individual hearings before being denied welfare. This is effective today, the result of your phone or an in-person interview before being accepted and or declined. In 1940, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, was established. In 1964, Johnson's War on Poverty is underway, and the Economic Opportunity Act was passed, commonly known as the Great Society. After the Great Society legislation of the 1960s, for the first time, a person who was not elderly or disabled could receive a living from the government. This could include general welfare payments, health care through Medicaid, food stamps, special payments for pregnant women and young mothers, and federal and state housing benefits. Notice that this is around the same time that the black woman and the black man began to grow stronger as a unit, the 1960s. Remember, in part 1 we learned that at this time, marriages were at its best among Hebrew men and women. The Hebrew woman had begun to trust in her Hebrew man to make the decisions and to take care of her out. When 1968 rolled around, 2 years before what? The feminist movement took off, 4.1% of families were headed by a woman on welfare. By 1980, this increased to 10%. In the 1970s, California was the state with the most general welfare system. Virtually all food stamp costs were paid by the federal government. The government is quickly gaining trust in the mind of the Hebrew woman because she has been taught to define a man based on the amount of money he has acquired, because she is the key to keeping this nation in this perpetual state of blindness. If she tells her man he ain't nothing and ain't never going to be nothing, this is going to have a dramatic effect on him. He will even start to believe that he is nothing at all. If your neck didn't support your head, it would fall off your shoulders. In 2008, 28.7% of the households headed by single women were considered poor. Why? Because without the head, the neck is nothing. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, Illinois, in the Robert Taylor Projects. It's been 14 years since then, and I can still remember the address. The first public housing projects were made possible by the Public Works Administration and then the Federal Housing Act of 1937. Prior to World War II, there were 4 projects, all comprised of low-rise, 2 to 4-story buildings. 3 projects were opened in 1938, Jane Addams houses on the near west side, comprising 32 buildings for 1,027 families. Julia C. Lathrop homes on the north side for 925 families, and Thrumbo Park homes on the far south side for 426 families. These 3 were built for whites until something similar to the Children's Aid Society happened when whites wanted to move into the rural area of cities to escape their new black neighbors. So a 4th project was established, the Ida B. Wells homes, in the ghetto for blacks. This was the beginning of the welfare or project experiment, as it was far larger than the other projects and housed 1,662 families. Most of the high-rise projects of the 1950s and 1960s took one basic form. They were larger than the earlier developments, ranging from 150 to 4,415 apartments. Most were built in superblocks. Streets that had previously traversed the redeveloped areas were ripped up, replaced by what were supposed to be grassy areas. The structures were high-rise apartment buildings with elevators, many reaching 15 to 19 stories. In style, they were modern but plain, following a no-frills principle. These high-rise projects were opened in 1955. Grace Abat Homes was the largest, with 1,200 apartments and 40 buildings covering what had been 10 city blocks. A series of large projects formed the State Street Corridor, a narrow zone of public housing more than 4 miles long. The corridor included Stateway Gardens, 1958, which comprised 8 buildings, and Robert Taylor Homes, 62, the largest public housing projects in the United States. When it opened, Robert Taylor Homes had 4,415 units and 28 identical 16-story buildings. After 1950, public housing began rapidly to deteriorate. Some buildings had serious design flaws. All buildings were subject to hard use and were badly maintained, which accelerated their deterioration. Most families that occupied these apartments weren't families at all, as a family would consist of a man, woman, and child. These families now centered around the black woman and her child. Potential candidates were single Hebrew women with children, and that is how it's supposed to stay. Black men were not encouraged to live with a woman. If she came there alone, she was to continue to be alone.
Honey, get rid of the TV and hide. Mom, it's Miss K back, the social worker. Well, don't just stand there, honey. Let her in. Miss K back. Hi, kid. Hi, you, Miss K back. Hi. How are you, Mrs. Fry? Oh, just fine. Fine. But, you know, they haven't sent me the authorization to buy the food stamps for the past 6 months. And then they cut me off for non-purchase. You know, Miss K back, why do they keep messing with me all the time? The system's one big screw-up. Well, I'm glad to hear you say it, because no one... So you're the gentleman that's been keeping company here.
Well, no, ma'am, I'm just a garbage man.
Well, may I have your name, please?
Simpson.
First name?
That's my first name.
Oh, your can't do that anymore. But we do have to know what's going on. And you live here or elsewhere. Is that a gift you're giving to the family? Do you contribute to the support of this whole family?
Whoa, lady. You gonna tell us you can have this set? It didn't cost you in the city a damn dime, but you gonna tell us you can have it, right?
Oh, I didn't make the rules, sir. I'm only doing my job.
The welfare ain't doing nothing for me, lady.
But the welfare is supporting Mrs. Price. Supporting? Supporting shit. He gave me this. He gave me this. Yes, he gave it to me. Then he gave me this. Now we have to hide this shit. You believe? Yes, he gave me this. We have to hide this. He gave us this too, but it don't work. That's right. Now I have to hide my man in the toilet. Miss Quebec, do you hide your man in the toilet? Mrs. Price, we want to help. Believe me. We know that children need a man in the house. A woman needs a man in the house. We don't insist people be married.
You mean you'd help a man move in if he's not married to the mother?
That's right.
That's immoral.
We're trying to deal with the realities.
What kind of example is that to set for the children?
Oh, what kind of example are you setting right now?
I ain't the government.
We'd love to see you get married.
Yeah, I'm hip you would. It would take the government off the hook and put me on. That's me, no more questions.
So a bitterness erupted somewhere in the Hebrew woman, a certain longing for her better half as she struggled to support their children. She began to blame this man more and more for his absence. She began to distrust him more and more, while on the other hand, she began to gain the sympathy of her government more and more. You see, it fed her, clothed her, and provided her a place to stay. No longer could she be wrapped inside the arms of a strong Hebrew man, but she was now under the covering of her government. I rarely saw my dad growing up in the projects, and uncles most often had to hide when the social worker came by. And so, with the Hebrew man behind him scared, the woman can now stand out front as head of the household. She could now take hold of her supposed independence.
See, not all our men are clowns. You know, not all our men are buffoons, are performers, monkeys, porch monkeys, niggas. You know what I'm saying? We have some lions of Zion, believe it. You know what I'm saying? So now craftier counsel has to be taken. Now, for these special men to go deeper, we got to really find a way to get them, because no matter what we do, his woman gonna depend on him. You know what I'm saying? And no matter what we do, because he shows his children a man, they're going to respect him as such. You know what I'm saying? So we got to find another way to tie him to those horses. You understand? We got to find another way to rip him apart.
So yeah, society has done a number on the Hebrew man, but that's why it's most important that we find out who we are. I must first know why it is acceptable for me to sag my pants in order to stop sagging my pants, if you can understand that. I must first know why this garbage is being pumped into my communities. You know what I'm saying? This thug image, where the same 5 songs are being played on the radio continuously. I must understand why that's being done in order to fix the problem. I must know that there is a problem. You see, most brothers don't know how to be a man. That's why they aren't men. That's why they still call their friends their boys. And that's why they still have girlfriends. I ain't gonna never have no girlfriend. I'm gonna have a wife because I'm a man. And I ain't gonna be nobody's boyfriend because I'm a man. You see, but you have to first know what it is to be a man.
Disgusting. Toss, that's your problem. You always down on a brother. That's why you never have any dates.
Man, I don't want any dates with no Nintendo playing, trash talking, pants hanging off they butt wearing underachievers such as yourself.
I don't play Nintendo. Genesis John Madden Football 93. That's my game.
Mama, look, can I talk to you now, please? Yes, baby, what is it? Okay. See, there's this sweet cross-colored jacket.
I don't have it.
But you don't even know what I'm gonna say.
I know it's gonna end with give me some money.
Yeah, but Mama, see, this jacket is dope.
Oh, man, that bitch is fine. Excuse me?
Mama!
Did I just hear you call someone a bitch? Oh, Ma, I didn't mean it like that. It's just an expression. You know, like girl, woman, bitch. I see. They're all interchangeable. Is that it? Am I a bitch? Is your sister a bitch? Can I answer those separately? Hey, chill, girl. How you know I meant you? Oh, I did mean him, You just better watch your mouth in my house, understand?
Mama, look, can you let me finish now? See, this jacket's on sale at Oak Tree till Friday. 50% off.
Fine. All you need now is the other 50%.
And my dad'll give me the money.
Then get it from your dad. All you gotta do is find his trifling ass.
Go.
Breaks a tackle and gets the first down.
Michigan's offensive line is really
Hey, baby. That's really nice of you, sweetie, but we already have some food here.
Tim, what are you doing in here?
We're trying to watch the game. That's right behind you.
My book club is meeting in here tonight.
Baby, remember when we talked last month? You said it was okay if we watched the game?
Oh, yeah. Well, Eva changed all that. She was supposed to tell you.
What she did?
Hey, it's the men. What are you fellas doing here?
Are you joining our book club? It's going to be very enlightening.
Sweet, precious. Listen, would it be okay? I mean, you know, if you could take it in the other room? Because we're all settled in. Right? That would be nice.
Well, I guess we could.
Yeah. You got a good girl. I love you, baby. Come on.
No, we cannot.
Oh.
Michael, Timothy, Daryl. Our book club is reading Beloved, and we're going to need the television to watch the film when we're done.
Oh, yeah, that's right, honey. We need the room.
You did not tell me you wanted to use the room in my house, Eva.
Well, I'm telling you right now, Timothy. And it is half my sister's house, too. Community property. You see, because I want Karina to make a good impression on the book club. Don't you?
No.
Excuse me?
Yes. Look, we were here first, Eva.
Yes, but certainly the temporal proximity of our advents isn't determinative. Is it?
I'll get back to you on that one.
What she just said right there. You don't get to me with your $50 words, Eva.
That's right. And what would you say if I demanded you to leave this room?
Yeah.
I would say I find your particular brand of crack very amusing. This isn't about a book versus a football game, fellas. Oh, no, this is about men versus women. Women who aspire to culture, and men who aspire to scratch themselves. Women who bear the burdens in life, and men who create those burdens. Women who uplift humanity, and men who uplift lap dances. If society were left to the whims of men, we'd still be in caves carving pictures with our non-opposable thumbs. So, today, gentlemen, is a day for civilized behavior. Today, we women raise our voices against tyranny, crudeness, and playoff games. And that is it. Gentlemen, end of story. The fat lady's singing! Out of the room. By the way, if any of that was lost upon you, then I've just proven my point again. Excuse me.
Karina, baby, I am putting my foot down.
If you put a slave in a hog pen and train him to live there and incorporate him to value it as a way of life completely, the biggest problem you would have out of him is that he would worry you about provisions to keep the hog pen clean or partially clean, or he might not worry you at all. On the other hand, if you put this same slave in the same hog pen and make a slip and incorporate something in his language whereby he comes to value a house more than he does a hog pen, you got a problem. In other words, you teach this black woman to value her way of life without Yah, Yahushua, or her Hebrew man, a physical protection. You teach her to be independent and to appreciate the scraps from the government's table, while distrusting the meat from her own. But do not teach her her natural role in society. If you do this, and she becomes aware of whom she is and her role as a woman, then you've got a problem. But because of the promise Yah made with Father Abraham to increase his seed, and the fact that the mind has a strong tendency to correct and recorrect itself over time, she can't help but to continue to reconnect with her natural partner. I mean, let's face it, they need each other, and it is why the Hebrew nation continues to increase.
From that time, Yahushua began to teach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
The kingdom comes. Be ready for the time when it arrives. Time is precious, of the essence, and it waits for no man. So you could run out of time if you have no plan. We are in desperate times. You shouldn't waste any time. Be sure it's well spent. Don't take 1 second for granted. The kingdom comes. Be ready for the time when it arrives. The kingdom comes. Be ready for the time when it arrives. Stay rooted and planted in who you are and supposed to
Different roles that women should play. And a lot of times we ignore those things, thinking it's outdated, but really it has a major impact on how we relate as a couple.
It does, because I was in the man role. I had a big penis, Monique.
Yes.
I mean, I'm telling you, now ladies, I bet the ladies won't laugh at this one, but I wanted control. Yes. I had to have it. And it was painful for my husband because he wanted to lead. Men want to lead.
Yes.
And it was like everything he did, I didn't want it that way. It had to be my way or the highway. And that was going to lead us to a divorce.
Yep.
Well, Carl, what role should men play? What is your role?
Well, we have 4 roles for men. The first one, what I call the monk, is setting direction, setting the goals and objectives for the family. Like, we want to know what's going on next year, what we're doing this weekend, whatever, but me as a man saying what we're going to do, being a leader, being accountable to everything that's going on within the household, being present with my wife, being the soldier, men being willing to sacrifice on behalf of their wife, their children, their family. So there's something I want to do, but my wife's not feeling well. Hey, I'm canceling that appointment, I'm going to be with her. And then being the negotiator, being able to communicate, like what's on my mind, what's going on, where we're going. It's very important for men.
So pretty much, you take the leadership role. You are the king of the castle.
Yeah, I take full accountability for what goes on in our house.
What's our role, sis?
Oh, well, this is one that I wasn't taught by my mother, my grandmother, or my great-grandmother, but it's actually surrender. Some women say submission, but I won't curse on national television because a lot of women, that's a curse word, submission. But we have 4 roles. One is the lover. That is, she is sweet, she is relaxed, and she enjoys sex. A lot of women don't even enjoy sex anymore because we've not been taught, like you said in the other segment. Another piece of our role is the conservationist. We have to conserve our energy. We have to really be building up our own energy so we can smile when he gets home, so we're not so stressed out all the time. The third thing is actually the visionary, and that is trusting. I didn't know how to trust. I didn't know how to trust. I didn't know how to trust a man. I didn't trust him. So that's a real big thing with the visionary. And finally, the devotee, being devoted to his dreams. His dreams include your dreams. So supporting those was very important for us, and those are the 4 female gender roles.
Yeah. See, what I'm thinking about this right now is because we started getting taught, be independent, be independent. And I think when we start hearing that, it starts taking us further and further apart from our men. Because we start saying to them, we don't need you, we independent. Right. I absolutely agree with submission. I don't care if people think it's a bad word. I submit to my king. I submit to my husband. My husband is the leader. My husband is the king of the castle. I believe in that, baby.
But where did you learn that?
Well, you know what?
Women aren't learning that.
You know where I learned that, though, Kenya? I learned that from my husband, without him even having to say it, because I thought I had a penis too. And in the relationships I had before my husband, I really believed I did. Until you get around some wiser women and they say to you, you P sitting down for a reason. He stands up for a reason. Know your position. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and I'm glad you're saying it the way you saying it, mama. And I know some of y'all, it's not popular, and some single women, you're mad as hell right now, but that's why you're single, because you think you're the man in a relationship. We're not, baby. Be okay with being a woman.
And it feels so good.
That's the question. Do you feel the power in the submission?
Yes.
See, women think there's no power in that. That's where all the power is. Sit back, let him do what he needs to do to support you and the family.
And he's in full service to
He's
you.
in
My
full
husband's
service.
Pat this nail.
I got that on camera. Okay, bye.